Let's do it.
Peter, thanks for doing this. Looking forward to this discussion. We connected on Noster over a mutual interest and experience in China. And as we were just discussing, you kind of feel like the discourse on China is incomplete, if not outright inaccurate in, I'm sure, many instances. So why don't you introduce a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get started.
Sure. Again, really appreciate you finding the time to throw me into this weekly sort of podcast of yours. But interesting sort of background. I'll try to make it as succinct as possible. But by all means, when I get through with it, fire away with any questions, because you know, you can pull on certain threads. It'll go in a bunch of different directions. But
Sure.
Basically, I arrived here in Shanghai, Spring Festival, 1996. So
Wow.
better part of 30 years ago. Yeah, that's one way to sort of phrase it. But I think what's super interesting is, you know, when you're early going on mid-20s, where you kind of think you know everything, but you're directionless a bit. That's kind of where I was at. I was working on Wall Street, super fortunate. I was working at what nowadays would be referred to as a family office. It was a company called Brundage, Story and Rose. And I was working in there as what is now referred to as an emerging market analyst. And it just so happened where, you know, right place, right time, 1992, 1993 was the first time when China really popped up as a possible investment theme. And at that point, sort of two things connected for me. Number one was I hated my job. You know, very stuffy. The joke I would always tell people was their idea of diversification was, you know, 1/3 oil, 1/3 gold, 1/3 GE. And, you know, there I was trying to sort of, you know, pitch ideas of LATAM, Asia Pac. Nobody cared. So I thought, okay, what else can I do? And, you know, I decided, you know what? Labor is a commodity. Always believe that. I need to add value to that commodity. So let me learn Chinese. Now, you know, before you start going, wow, that's great. Keep in mind, you know, 22, 23 in New York City, single. I was lucky if I got to class, let alone studied, and did that for about 1.5 years, at which point the teacher I was working with, who was a mainlander, said to me, you know, paraphrasing, I think, you know, look, are you serious about this? And I said, yeah, definitely serious. And he said, well, look, I've got a bunch of these schools all through China that are coming to me. They're in desperate need of English teachers. And I thought, you know what, 24, 25, whatever it was, you know, I'll go there for 1.5 years. I'll teach English, see what the lay of the land is, and then, you know, come back here, have the language sorted out, get a little bit of China knowledge, and go from there. So that was kind of what launched me directly into China back in '96. And I will tell you, it was, you know, love at first sight. I just enjoyed it. It was completely new. You know, if you think about 1996, you know, the internet was just kind of starting. I literally left right after Netscape had launched. So all my friends were laughing.
It's a hell of a time to leave Wall Street. 96. I mean, you know, right as the tech boom is really getting going.
Correct. And to this day, friends of mine, you know, continue to laugh. Now, granted, quick aside, you know, they all piled into the .com bubble as I was,
and lost their shirts.
Making you know, $200 a month teaching English at the beginning. But they ended up losing it all. They put all the money into, you know, the quintessential pets.com and whatnot. But for me, what was great was, you know, I did a 1.5 year stint teaching English. And then I got ended up at the time, got married super early, met a woman at the, you know, 25, 26, was like, all right, let me get serious. And I got a job working for basically Barclays, but it was their investment bank, which is no more, called BZW. And I landed that job in August of 1997, literally as the Asian financial crisis was ripping across the landscape. So, you know, it was a 4-month, you know, maelstrom of hell and fury of, you know, the market's going everywhere, literally South Korea blowing up, Thailand blowing up, Hong Kong even blowing up. And I was out of a job by January of 98. At that point in time, I had a child on the way, trying to make ends meet. To sort of truncate things.
Were you in Shanghai this whole time?
The whole time. I've been in Shanghai this entire time, yeah.
Sweet.
But then, fortunate enough, late 98, got a job out of all places, Nationwide Financial. Essentially, I became a serial chief rep, which is essentially, for those who are not, I think you are aware what these are, but you're basically an overpaid sort of, secretary to a certain extent. You're boots on the ground. You're there representing a certain company. You make, appointments for when your senior management comes into town, and did that from about 1998 to 2004. And in the sort of last real job that I had, I was working for Prudential Financial of lovely Newark, New Jersey, as a project manager, setting up a joint venture for them in the investment management space. And to sort of put a final cap on this point, one of the things that I realized while I was working for Pru was I was in the process of setting up this massive joint venture, and it was a headache at every which turn. But I was still having to, either talk to, risk and legal at night, or write memos, or, do a bunch of sort of hand holding with corporate. And I began to realize, I wonder if I can do this as an outsourcing agent, meaning rather than have the people on the ground doing this, they can come to a third party to help them out. So in 2004, I quit Pru and started my own company, which is called Zeben Advisors. And essentially we do market research, data analytics, the lot, looking at the broader investment space, which, whether you're, again, Ray Dalio, which I know you and your friends like Preston sort of rag on from time to time with their China focus, but essentially whether it's groups that are looking to invest into China or groups that are looking to build businesses in the investment space, the company that I now run and own essentially helps out on the sidelines. And, I've been doing that for the better part of 20 years.
So the company you now own does what? Kind of advises people looking to excuse me, invest in China, get set up in some capacity?
It's multifaceted. The bread and butter of the business is essentially research. So we provide essentially business to business market research. So, we do client notes a couple times a week, or, various monthly or quarterly reports that our clients buy the research on an annual subscription basis. On top of that, however, we'll get, I'll give you an example, not to lead the conversation, but I think it's relevant. In, what was it, February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, clients called me up saying, well, what does this mean for China and Taiwan? And that's maybe the outlier, the most extensive point. But, our clients can call me up for a varied range of different topics, where I'll just run through sort of my point of view, what we're seeing on the ground, just give them some guidance, and a lot of times just peace of mind.
Right. Let me ask you this. So when I first arrived, I showed up September, I think, of 2009. And my first memory of the place was I was staying at the Seagull Hotel on the Bund. I don't know if it's even still there. But it's not still there. Yeah. It's kind of like an old and smelly hotel, but it was right on the Bund. And I went outside. I went up to the little outdoor eating area they had right along the water, and there was a typical sort of Huangpu fog like over the area, and the Pudong, right? It's where all the tall buildings are. The lights were all flashing, and I was like, the smell was in the air, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like it's something I'd been thinking about for a long time, and I was there right in the center of it all. So that's my first memory. You said, as soon as you got there, you kind of fell in love. And 96 is very different than 2009 in China years. So what was your first memory when you first landed?
Well, I mean, I think the funniest sort of anecdote I tell people is I landed, and you'll appreciate this. I mean, when I landed, there was only one airport, and that was in Hongqiao, and there was only one term. It was like the only airport that had been there since God knows when. I got picked up by the school, and it was interesting. Back in the day, they had this group of people called the Y Band, and their only responsibility was to watch over, any of the foreign teachers or any of the foreign students.
Wow.
So they picked me up in one of these like little, I don't know, they call it a mianbao shi. It's like, it looks like a the bread basket type of thing, and they drove me to where I was staying. And again, I had no idea where I was staying, what the deal was. And, I get out of the car, they're going to show me to where the room I'm staying in. And the guy floats me 400 RMB, which at the time was a lot of money. And he said, look, here's an advance on your salary. The first thing you need to do is go buy a bicycle. And I was like, I'm like, okay. And I'm like, why? And they said, well, you're living here. This is the graduate campus. You're actually teaching 5 kilometers up the road at the undergraduate campus, and you have to bike there every day. It takes about 20 minutes. The biggest one of the bigger differences between, say, 96 and 09 is everybody had bicycles back in 96. There were no cars. And when I mean everybody, it was like one of those quintessential China pictures where you would get to a stoplight and there would be 1,000 bikes waiting to go. So, it was like 2 days later, I have to get out. It took me 30 minutes to cross the road. It was that just mind boggling. But it was super interesting because it was like, okay, I threw myself into this. I'm going to get out. I'm going to make this work. So I turned it into just this giant sort of, fun game. I would get on buses. I had no idea where they were going. It would get off somewhere. I had a map. But it was just completely different. I mean, the place, again, there was no internet, no access to information. You had no idea what was going on outside the 4 walls of the mainland.
Man, it's hard to imagine that time. When I think the expo was in 2010, right? And that was kind of like a bit of a coming out party, as might have been the Beijing Olympics and stuff like that. But, they reconstructed the bund and they polished up a lot of stuff. And so that was kind of a coming out party for Shanghai. And I guess somewhat of a moment, the demarcation moment for me, but only a year after I arrived. But for you, from 96 onward, what were some of the points where you're like, oh, things really changed? So for example, the bicycle point. I mean, when I was there was a ton of e-bikes, on every stoplight. And they were all over the sidewalks at the time. And as I understand, it's a lot more controlled now, unfortunately, because I thought that was really, I loved being able to just jump up on the sidewalk and scooter around anywhere. But, by the time I got there, it was luxury cars everywhere, not bicycles. So what were some of the moments or periods where you really noticed that things changed a lot in Shanghai?
Well, there were, just a number of them. So, again, I'm not trying to drive the conversation in any particular way, but I think the first thing that shocked me was, I think I'd been sort of in Shanghai for about a month. I was staying at this place, I had a couple of the teachers, and I was the only one really who came here with some business experience. Almost everybody who was a foreigner here was either a former East Asian studies major, some liberal arts university, and they were over teaching English, or they were sort of expats on the other side of town. But I remember the teachers that had been sort of there longer than I had took me out one night, and we were having dinner in this back street from the school, and chit-chatting away. We, again, clueless. And one of the waitresses came up and realized that we were all happened to be Americans. And she literally said to us in Chinese, like, are we going to war with you guys? Is China and America going to war? And we were like, what are you talking about? And it just so happened that Taiwan was having its first universal suffrage vote, where a gentleman by the name of Li Tenghui was going to be essentially elected democratically for the first time to president of Taiwan. And at the same time, then president or chairman of the Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, he was lobbying, as they do, lobbing missiles into the Taiwan Straits and, doing everything else. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton, unbeknownst to us, sitting in the middle of China without any access to real information, President Clinton had sent not one, but two carrier fleets into the Taiwan Strait. So, we left dinner and we're like, we need a local newspaper. We need to figure out what's going on. And then, over time, cooler heads subsided. But look, I mean, 2001, it was before 9/11. There was the United States had a sort of a bit of a quasi dogfight to a certain extent with a spy plane of ours that crashed in Hainan after running into a Chinese fighter jet. There was basically a hostage situation in Hainan Island back in 2001. People forget about. Then there was a couple of years prior to that, and it was Mother's Day, which I'll never forget. 1999, the United States was at war in Serbia, and the United States, quote unquote, accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy, killing a handful of Chinese citizens. Well, this place exploded. There was, riots outside the embassy up in Beijing.
What year was that?
Friends of mine, 1998, May of 98. So that was that. I remember sitting in the Shangri-La Hotel in Pudong celebrating Mother's Day, and that was back when we had all our old Nokia phones with those green little screens, and everybody's text messages were going off at the same time because it was ugly. People, were, I wouldn't say targeting Americans, but it was the threat because it was, it was seen as an attack on Chinese sovereignty to a certain extent. And then I would guess a couple years after that, it was, and this is, I think, pretty interesting, making the comparison to the pandemic. Now, we had SARS, the original SARS of 2003. And, clearly I was wrong on this account because when SARS hit in late 2002 into 2003, it was bad from about February to about April, May, and then it kind of disappeared. So when COVID hit in February of 2020, I'm sitting in my apartment at the time going, this will be over in a few months. This is everybody was fleeing Shanghai. They were going all over the place. So those are some of the bigger issues, but probably a ton more I could regale you with.
Sure.
Cognizant of your time.
We could speak forever about, Shanghai and all that kind of stuff. But I do want to ask you at least one more question. And it's interesting how we perceive change, right? Because I'm perceiving it from a starting point of 2009, whereas at that point you've already been there for over a decade. Right. But one of the things, and I had an amazing time in Shanghai. It's an incredible city, as you know. I mean, like I had too much fun early on, at least, because, it's so easy to have fun. You can just do whatever you want. There's bars and clubs and all sorts of, it's kind of, very, very easy to just, and inexpensive at, especially early days, to just have fun. Yep. Not the case anymore. It's very expensive in Shanghai the last time I was there. But the vibe is something I'd always been cognizant of. And part of that is because, anytime a place is changing so quickly, of course, the sentiment and the vibe and mood is going to shift. And I found when I showed up in 2009 and went to, I was in Shanghai, and then I did a couple of years in Beijing, but I left in 2013 for a year. And that first period, seemed way more, kind of footloose and fancy free. There was less rules. There was less negative attention on foreigners, let's say. And then when I came back in 2014, I noticed a bit of a edge. One, things were becoming a little bit more so-called orderly, so it wasn't as, gray area sort of vibe around regulations and all that kind of stuff. And then, perhaps China was ascending and the geopolitical consciousness was rising with that. And so there was more competitive sort of component to people's perception of foreigners and geopolitics and that kind of stuff. So I noticed that vibe had shifted a bit. And then by the time I left in 2018, I would say that had just kind of kept going. Not to say that, life was really that much different, but the way you were treated was a little bit different, and there was certainly a lot more rules. The police presence was growing. It just seemed like more order or control, if you like, was kind of emerging. So does that assessment resonate with you? And if so, like, how did that play out on the timeline that you've been there for?
No, you're spot on, John. And number one, it's continued. And the way that I sort of looked at it is, in retrospect, to give you even sort of a sharper contrast to what you're talking about, I now realize, only in retrospect, I mean, I realized this a few years ago, that from 2000 to 2010 were, as foreigners, and I think this is an important distinction to make, as foreigners, 2000 to 2010 was the glory day of sort of being in Shanghai, probably being in China. It was a period where I always told people, half jokingly, that there were only three things that you could not do in China. You could not use, buy, or sell drugs, use, buy, or sell weapons, or talk disparagingly about the party. Everything else was workable. You could find solutions. And again, I mean, back then you would have people that would be up here on, business visas that were working. You had, foreigners were setting up companies, and they were doing it in sort of, I wouldn't call them dodgy ways, but China has historically always been able, you've been able to operate in the gray area. There's black and there's white, but there's a lot of gray.
Ask for forgiveness, not permission, was the line I always heard.
Correct. And again, I think what's interesting is, there are ebbs and flows, and the amount of gray that you can operate in has become, much more constricted. But at the same time and again, I'm sure you would have seen it. I mean, there were a lot of foreigners here that were, personally, I believe, were taking advantage of the situation that they had. And
you mean just misbehaving, or?
I would say misbehaving, not being respectful a lot of times. Like, I will tell everybody that comes here, I said, just have humility. Like, you're in a foreign country. You are a minority. And they're opening the door and they're welcoming you, and you have an opportunity. I say to people all the time, and not to drop Chinese, but it's like, 如果没有中国没有我, which means, without China, I'm nothing, because I've literally spent more than half my life here. But, learned the hard way, had my hard knocks. But a lot of the foreigners who were here, and I think your period was really unique because you saw sort of the tail end of that glory day period, and then kind of got into the period, let's call it what it is, the ascension of, Xi Jinping coming into power, a very clear move towards a system that was going to be more rigid in terms of policies, rules, regulations, whatever, that you were required to follow. And I think that was more of a cultural issue for a lot of the foreign community to deal with, because now they were, maybe this is too harsh, but they were being put on a leash, which they hadn't been before. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And what year did Xi come into power?
He came into power in 2011. I think it was 2011 that he became head of the party, and then 2012 became head of the government. So
another one of the things
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, another one of the things I noticed at that time, which stopped pretty abruptly when she came in, and I suspect your experience will be similar. I mean, because if you were a foreigner in Shanghai in that period, I mean, at least this was my sense, is like, I would often find myself in situations, parties, events, this kind of stuff. I was like, this is way too fancy and special for me to be there. Like, why am I invited to this stuff? Like, in that period of Shanghai, like, you'd be rubbing shoulders with, extremely wealthy and influential and this sort of people in the most lavish, amazing events, and everything would be, and I'd be like, how did I get here? Why am I here? And oftentimes in that time in China, I mean, the answer might just be because you're white and you're
You're a foreigner.
You look respectable. Yeah, you're a foreigner and you look quasi respectable, and that's why you're here.
Right.
And that's just the way it was. And so, I met a lot of government people. I met a lot of, wealthy local entrepreneurs, wealthy, foreign heads of companies, the whole expat thing. And I remember when she came in, a lot of those lavish parties, which were oftentimes, set up to, to entertain or reward or incentivize or schmooze, certain government people, like all that stuff dried up. And all of a sudden, I remember specifically some of the party planners in the city were like, we need to find a new business model, basically. And they were, scrambling to find, other people to host parties for. Other thing to do was fancy venues, because they were no longer hosting all these government official parties, because that money, that, so corrupt money, let's say, was no longer there for them to spend. And that was like very evident when she came into power.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first thing that he did, and again, I mean, it's been super interesting to watch how it's played out over the course of the last 10 years, really, where it was crackdown on corruption, and I would argue, I don't think many people would disagree with this, that Xi Jinping's first rule or first job when he came into power was to straighten out the Communist Party. The way that I phrased it to clients was, he came in at a time where the center was having a hard time holding. There were a lot of, you probably heard the line, right? The hills are high and the emperor's far away, meaning, if you could be in, Guangdong province or God knows where, China, in my opinion, was, I wouldn't say breaking, but it was very evident that you were starting to see regional powers starting to sort of pop up. And that has historically, over thousands of years, been the demise of various dynasties. And I think this did not go unaware. You must have been, you were here, clearly. Do you remember the Bo Xilai incident?
I was just about to bring it up. Yeah. Perfect example.
I mean, that was, clearly another princeling that was vying for power. I would argue he was more charismatic than Xi. And the irony is that people forget about was, like, when I first got here and Jiang Zemin was coming into power, he had a tussle as well. There was this guy named Chao Shi who was like old hardline, who tried to sort of usurp Jiang, and Jiang won. So, I just as a quick aside, I always laugh when people talk about the Chinese Communist Party as being the sort of monolithic, works as one type of entity, which it's not. I mean, it's, arguably it's as uniparty as the United States is now, right? But it was interesting because, Jiang or Xi and Bo went at it. Xi Jinping, was able to come down and saying, look, we do, Bo Xilai was literally creating, a power center in Chongqing, in basically Sichuan province. And I think there was the threat of some of that happening elsewhere that required literally a 5-year campaign to crush corruption. He had Wang Qishan, running as number 2 on that. And you're right, the party stopped. I always love the stories about the guys taking their watches off. And again, it was, people were being, gone through and saying, look, if we find that you were not, holding to a level that was required of the Communist Party, you were in serious trouble. And again, I mean, is that the right way, the wrong way? My telling of it to clients, as an example, or others, is it's culture. This is how China has done things for thousands of years. But yeah, I mean, you would have seen right when he came in, that was continued, and that first 5 years was all about, cracking down and the anti-corruption campaign.
I remember I had a friend who was a GM at a hotel in Macau, and I had been, keeping an eye on that place for a while, because I just thought it was fascinating how gambling revenues in Macau, I can't remember the year, but they exceeded Las Vegas. And part of the reason for that was because at least the stat at the time was a Chinese gambler will gamble 10 times more than their American counterpart. And that's part of the reason why Macau exploded so quickly. But after this campaign, gambling revenues in Macau crashed like 80% or something crazy like that, because so much of all these government officials, and I knew some of them, and they would always kind of joke, like, a lot of them educated abroad, a lot of them educated in the US. They would come back, highly credentialed, and you'd think they'd get a job with, some multinational or some big, local company, but they get some, seemingly menial government job where they get paid like 10,000 RMB a month, but they get 100 times that under the table. And that's why they do it. And they go spend it in Macau. They spend it on lavish parties, the whole thing. There was obviously a whole economy, predicated on, corrupt money, dark political money. And it was huge, and it was everywhere. And I remember when when they pulled the plug on that, Macau like took a nosedive. And I guess they also, everyone had to kind of reconsider their business model, because if you don't have all that easy money from the whales, the government official whales coming down and spending millions and millions of dollars, well, you got to figure something else out. And that happened when I was there too. And I remember the GM that I knew was like, not too happy about it.
No, and again, I mean, I think where there's been an oversight, and this is one of just many for me, is when I'm talking with people saying, this was actually not just quote unquote good, however you want to define it, but it was a necessity. I genuinely think that if there wasn't that first 5-year crackdown on corruption, I don't think the center would have held. And it has nothing to do with an over-leveraged economy or any of this. I just think that the various factions, within the Communist Party had really started to break off. And it required someone to come in and say, all right, we're going to try to do this, not specifically just he himself and his people, but there was a group of others that agreed with him and tried to, really, using another proverbial here, it's like steady the boat, if you will. I think it worked. And then it just continued to carry on from there.
What happened a couple of weeks ago where they're in the party Congress or whatever it's called, and the guy sitting to the left of Xi, I don't know the characters these days really, but he was escorted out. Was it Hu Jintao? Yeah. So, it was Hu Jintao. And he was just escorted out, and Xi, as always, very kind of pan face, unemotional. I don't even think he looked at him or glanced at him and looked away. What was that scenario there? What was going on?
Well, everybody has their own opinion. And this actually kind of will get into the meat of what I think is some of the important elements here. Because take what you were just describing, right? And bear with me. Give me some runway here. You were just describing a 5-year period while you were here, and these lavish parties, and clearly illicit, shall we say, funds making their way throughout. That then gets cracked down. Now, what happens when there is that kind of crackdown? You're cutting people off where it matters most, right? So what I've discovered inadvertently through a couple of conversations, to your specific point about the Hu Jintao incident, is you had that 5-year period, so the first 5 years of Xi Jinping in power, and it was predominantly about the crackdown on corruption. Then you had in 2017 what is called the 19th Party Congress, the last one prior to last year. And this was the year in which two, I would say, material messages were conveyed. Number one was a new growth model is required for China. Previously, from 1978 onwards, it was growth at all costs. We don't care how, just go, go, go. And again, I think that was one of the elements that led to the corruption issue. It's one of the elements that led to this center inability to hold. So, Xi Jinping decided to come in and say, look, we're going to do a growth model that's about quality growth rather than growth at all costs. And number two was that this was going to be done with the same, rather, call it vested interest, the senior most people in the Communist Party Now, these were from different factions, but there was an agreement that this is what they wanted to follow, and Xi Jinping was going to lead this, and fine, that's what went forward. I won't bore you necessarily with all the gory details, but what seems to have occurred is between 2017 and 2022, between the 19th and 20th Party Congress, even though there were agreements within the party at, the Zhongnanhai, their sort of Capitol Hill, there was a low level, I don't know if civil war is too strong a word, but there were parties that were trying to undermine Xi's move to this new growth model, because everybody that was in power was losing that power. They were losing their ability to sort of gain financially in certain ways, and all of the people that were in from senior down to middle, and it wasn't just the government, it was the regulators, state-owned enterprises, basically the party apparatus writ large. These were individuals that had come to power under both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And it became clear by late 2021, but especially 2022, that these sort of counterforces were trying to find a way to neuter somewhat the power that Xi Jinping had amassed. So that was clearly not working. And only my opinion, I think the event with Hu Jintao being pulled out was a very not, overt. It was clearly overt to try to tell everybody, yeah, I'm in charge now. I tried to work with you for 5 years across different factions within the party. We're going to move to quality growth. We're going to do things that he thinks are best for the country. Now, I have no idea if it's going to work, but he has a plan. And it's interesting that he's now said, I'm done trying to work within the party. I'm doing it my way with the people that I trust. Right. And that Hu Jintao issue was bringing that out to the forefront. Right.
Just saying, a public display of power, basically saying, look, the guy right to my left, I can have him removed unceremoniously in front of everyone. So that's how I get down. What is the plan, the quality growth plan? What does that mean?
It's depending on who you ask, it's tough to say. I'll give you a couple of points that sort of I am sort of picking up on. You're going to hear this thing called common prosperity. Now, normally, and again, as you probably can appreciate, just as a quick aside, John, my God, I get beaten with a sock full of quarters every time I have these conversations because, oh, Peter, you're just some shill for the CCP. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of the atrocities and other things that have been going on, I don't disagree with, but I also believe that you need to recognize the competitive nature of this basically nation that's competing with the United States, appreciate it, to understand it, to be able to effectively, come up with how best to engage or not. So that's one quick aside. But things like common prosperity is really an issue of dealing with income inequality. Again, you would have seen not just people in your heyday who were government officials, but I mean, the amount of money people had was insane.
Yeah.
Right.
People don't realize the wealth in China. It's just, there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And I've been to all the fancy mega wealthy centers like Monaco and Saint-Tropez and London and Miami, and there's nothing like it.
Right. And this has come from, look, one of the things that I love most, even going back to 1996, and one thing that has not changed whatsoever here, Chinese, and maybe I haven't been to a lot of countries, but Chinese are the hardest working people. They know that what they put in, we'll go the Bitcoin route, right? Proof of work. Mm-hmm. They work hard.
Oh yeah.
But you're going to have in any capitalist system, if you've got capital and mass more capital, you're going to, the income equality, especially with technology, again, Jeff Booth, right? You're going to see things where that is going to become an issue. And it's my belief in looking at how they're dealing with it, where they're going to be targeting predominantly the tech companies and saying, look, call it a dividend. We're going to force you to pay a dividend. The question that is unclear is, okay, fine, like with any government, okay, fine, you put the dividend into the government coffers, where does it go? We really haven't seen that side of it yet. Like, how does it trickle down to the average person that may not be doing as well? So common prosperity has been a work in progress. I don't think it's really been able to be let loose, going back to my earlier comments about the political infighting within the party itself. Beyond that, there's something else I've wanted to go to. Quality growth. Oh, look, things like trying to get, families not to have their children, basically overeducated. I mean, you probably saw this as well, where, if there's such a drive amongst Chinese families to get their child, or nowadays 2 children, to do quite well. So they're in school all the time. And the government is looking at ways to try and eliminate some of that. They targeted education programs and platforms over the last year. But really, I think what it's about is trying to get broadly the economic model in one where it is going to be more consumer driven. COVID really upset the apple cart with that. Last year definitely did so. And even post lockdown, which was really only, or not lockdown, post zero COVID, which really was only in December of last year. It's been a handful of months. We've got May holiday right now. Everybody seems to be out and spending, but it's really trying to move away from exports and investment to consumer as the driver for the economy. And the government's trying to drive that. Details TBD in a lot of respects, actually.
Why a policy of, notwithstanding that the old trope that the government wants you stupid, independent, and all that kind of stuff, but why would, you're right, I did witness, Chinese parents are extremely invested in having their children like excel educationally and academically. And so as you say, they go to school and they have after school programs and they have all sorts of stuff, it's a tremendous amount of pressure placed on a lot of these kids. But why would the government be wanting to, rein that in or minimize that?
It's more about, it's not about reining it in per se, it's more about balance. And I think that's really what all of this is about, is trying to create a balance where, historically it was all about, going out, getting the great job, making as much money, buying the house, buying the car. And quite frankly, if there's one thing that has been pretty much universal since I've been here, that's what every Chinese who I ever knew or had a relationship with or whatever, nobody ever reached that point and was happy. It was always like, okay, I did everything I was supposed to do. And I think that there's an understanding, and I don't want to give the government more credit than it deserves, but I just think that there is a recognition that having more balance within the economy, especially with whether it's the student, whether it's the employee, whether it's the company, makes more sense. Now, there are those out there that will say, well, this is, Leninist ideology. Xi Jinping is a full-on ideological Leninist. I don't think so. I just think that what you have is a very pragmatic group of people that are looking, and I know this may sound naive, but I think they're just looking to do what's right by their own people and change the dynamic. As I said before, I have no idea if it's going to work, but they're doing something different, and we'll see how it plays out.
Wasn't it a very common, again, trope saying something that, almost every Chinese citizen would have heard and kind of been oriented by, is to be rich is glorious? Did that come out in Deng Xiaoping's era, or I can't remember exactly when, but, which is ironic for a so-called communist country, that like one of the primary orienting quotes or beliefs of the people is to be rich is glorious, and everyone pursued that with like the utmost vigor. To your point about work ethic, a few minutes ago, and go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that. And it's funny because I see these comments all over the place on social media that, China is going back to its, communist ideology under Xi Jinping. I don't see it. What I see is a extremely hardworking capitalist society that has remained so, but now you've got some more guardrails in place. So I think to get rich is glorious is still front and center in a lot of people's minds. I just think the manner and the path to get there is become a lot more, call it, I wouldn't say restricted, but like I said, there's more guardrails on it. It's not a free for all. Yeah.
Well, there's two things I want to say about that. One is I remember, every time I would go back, typically for Christmas, people would be like, oh my, when I tell people I live in China, they're like, oh my God, like, what's it like? And are you oppressed? And what's it like living in a communist regime and all this kind of stuff? And of course, I'd just be like, you guys, you have no idea. I mean, what your perception is totally wrong. I feel far freer there. I feel like there's far less of a bubble intellectually. There's a ton of nationalism, and they've been propagandized for decades. So there is an element of that, but particularly in the younger generation. So when I was there, I'd often say like under 40, these people would be highly educated, very curious about the world, very open-minded, well-traveled, well-dressed, really getting after it. And so the impressive group of people that wasn't the impression that a lot of people back home had. But one of the other things I would often say is when people would ask about the government, my assessment was always that they were just extremely pragmatic. Now, you got to be careful with using that term, because like, where do you draw an ethical boundary in your own pragmatism? Because wherever you draw that boundary, that'll have a big influence on what you deem to be pragmatic and what you'll allow yourself to execute in the name of pragmatism. But nevertheless, when that was my assessment. Like they assess the situation, and if something is pragmatic in achieving the end of creating wealth or improving the quality of life or, doing better business more broadly, it seems like it would be decided very quickly. They break ground immediately, basically. And this was part of the reason why China had, such robust growth, or other reasons too, which we'll get into later around debt and money printing and all that kind of stuff. But just, ideologically, it was like, is this good? Is this productive? Is this, wealth creating? Okay, let's do it. Yeah. Whereas, what we're probably used to back home is 10 years of red tape, humming and hawing, back and forthing, and then, maybe it gets done, maybe it doesn't.
Let me just jump in. Let me give you the best anecdote for that, which is, and you'll be able to sort of provide a baseline for me as well. Between 2001 and I want to say, I don't know, what was it, 15 years, like 2016, 2017, after the towers fell in 9/11, I think it took 15 to 17 years to build Freedom Tower. And that was something that, the people wanted. Mm-hmm. Shanghai built 15 subway lines in that time because it was deemed necessary and they wanted to make this happen. There was limited red tape. It was a policy directive, not only from the Shanghai government, but I think from the Beijing government. So having that sort of streamlined bureaucracy, when it works quite well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been one of the big differences, because, what I find super interesting is I left New York City in 1995, and every time I go back, it's not the dynamic city I remember. Even before the pandemic, mm-hmm. It had become a far more, I would call it, bureaucratic city. So it's interesting how time does sort of change things, sort of like the frog in the boiling water.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should talk more about that as well, because, the comparison between capitalist America and communist China is often made. And, as we said before, in the setup of this, we want to get into the nuance there. But just back to your point about, the current policy of trying to even things out. I mean, from my economic philosophy, that is not the job of the government. And I would say a lot of the inequality that was in China, especially prior to enacting such a policy, I would say to the extent that it was unnatural, because you're always going to have some degree of inequality, it was probably still because of the intervention of the government. Because even with Xi coming in, I think there is still a lot of corruption. It's just the right kind, let's say, or it's contained in the right place. It's, as you were saying, it's not as disparate, it's not as broken apart. And so ideologically, whenever I hear like, well, the government is going to even things out and make things more fair, I'm like, well, I don't think so. I don't think that's how it works. They may achieve a certain, maybe they close the wealth gap, more than they make it closer than it is currently. But if the manner in which they do it, I think is somewhat illegitimate. And so, even if that outcome is quote unquote desired, which again, I don't think it is. What I'd like to see is a natural distribution of wealth based on a meritocracy, basically. And, everyone's subject to the same rules, and then people go about and they work and they create wealth, and it is what it is. Now, obviously that's an idealistic sort of perspective, because that circumstance doesn't prevail anywhere in the world today. But I do always get my guard up when I hear like, oh, the government's going to come and, make things fair and flatten the wealth gap a little bit, because as you say, what it means is more money goes into that government black box, and what happens to it? Well, what do they actually do with it? Is it just another money grab amongst many? So I just want to get my little bit in there about that particular policy.
No, I totally agree. And the only thing I'll dot your eye on that is I have no idea if anything, like I said before, I have no idea if what he's going to do is going to work. And I am a firm believer that less government is always better. But here's the situation that they're in, and we'll see how it plays out over the next couple of years. Yeah.
Well, we could talk about so many different aspects of China for hours, but one that's often talked about, and I think lacking nuance. So let's break into it. But oftentimes it goes something like this, because there's a lot of geopolitical jostling these days, and a lot of people think China is the next great superpower, and then a lot of people say no, no way, because it's a communist country, and yes, they've benefited from good favorable trade policies and lots of money printing and debt, but they've overbuilt, and this is always the case with central planning. You ultimately misallocate and destroy capital. No way they can compete with a capitalist country like the US or other countries. And so they think, the US's dominance will prevail for however many more years. And China's like the Japan of the 21st century, looked really good for a while, but ain't going to happen. The point that I often interject and make on that argument is I think people are erroneously, construing America as capitalist and China as communist in terms of their markets. Let's just forget politics for a second, although obviously they're related. Rather, I see it as a spectrum of wealth appropriation and redistribution, basically, and how much the government is involved in the economy. And so I think that the pro-American people should, be amenable to this argument, because a lot of times the socialist people in America will say the problem is capitalism, and those very same people will say, but we don't have pure capitalism in America. The government is a massive employer, a huge portion of the GDP. Obviously, if you're using government manipulated and issued currency, 50% of every transaction is a government product, i.e. the currency. So on what basis are we characterizing that as a voluntary free market economy? You simply can't, and equally in China, you would say, okay, well, the government is a big employer, a big owner of, capital broadly in the economy. Obviously, they have the same currency issue. So just strip away the ideology, strip away, the flags and the logos and all the emotion, and say, how different are these two systems or these two markets in terms of how much wealth appropriation and redistribution there is? And if you look at it that way, it's not, you're not looking at opposite ends of the spectrum. You're looking at things that are on the same spectrum. Now, I'm open to the argument, to hearing arguments that perhaps China is further on the spectrum of wealth appropriation redistribution. I'm not making that claim because I don't know if I have the proper data to do so, but I'm open to that kind of argument and saying, yeah, they're both on the spectrum. China is more on the spectrum of appropriation and redistribution, and therefore their market will not compete as well person per person, dollar for dollar to another market. And then of course you have to consider, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe broadly speaking, it's a less efficient, machine of capital creation and wealth creation. But what does it mean if they have 1 billion more people in that market, even if it does skew a little bit more on the appropriation and redistribution and capital misallocation and destruction metric? Like, what if you add 1 billion more people? And what if you add in their access to resources and et cetera on down the line? And so, well, then it may very well be more competitive than a market that is more free, but has less robust inputs, broadly speaking, in terms of labor and resources and such. And so that's what I would like to kind of throw over to you and say, how do you respond to this, very oversimplified dichotomy between the two economies and why one is better or will inevitably outcompete the other? How do you talk about that? You obviously, I'm sure you write about it for your clients and such. So, over to you on, I shared my bit on that. So I'd love to hear yours.
I think they're sort of two, you got to take it on two tracks. There's the absolute points, meaning what's going on in the US in that regard, what's going on in China, and then the relativeness between those two systems. So again, I'm not claiming that I have all the answers here, but I can tell you that in the near 30 years that I've been here, I've watched the United States move in a direction that I would say is less capitalist in the broadest sense, meaning, look, when I was growing up, I tell people all the time, like, look, I'm a child of Reagan, be it good or be it bad. From 10 to 18, Reagan was president. There was nothing that really stopped you. If you put your mind to it and you put your heart into it and so on and so forth, you could get anything done. I mean, I literally got my job on Wall Street by knocking on doors and saying, I'll work for you for free. I read that in a book. And, I got kicked out of 30 places, and I had interviews with 3, and one of them said yes. And, there you go. You couldn't do that now. The walls that are sort of up, and again, it goes to the whole equality versus, or the opportunity versus the outcome issue. And I think that that's a genuine issue that exists in the United States. And now it's gotten all sort of tied up with, pronouns and woke and God knows what else is going on in the States. And I think that's, for me, some of the more strategic issues that, China's been looking at, not to get off topic, but, it's the old adage, like, there's no need to do anything when your enemy's making mistakes by themselves.
Right.
China, on the other hand, yes, exactly. Wait by the river. Correct. But then, China, on the other hand, it's a pendulum, I guess it was by 78. I mean, coming out of the Cultural Revolution, it was like everything, including agriculture, and there was no real industry. Everything was owned by the state. And then, I don't know, by 2010, 2015, it was clear that, there was a lot more movement towards privatization, a lot more big, successful growth companies that were privately owned. And then now what we're seeing is the pendulum move in the other direction. We're seeing, more resources being put to the state-owned enterprises. Now, on the one hand, the state-owned enterprise as a platform, if you will, has shrunk enormously in the time that I've been here, but it's still significant. And I believe if you're allocating resources to a state-owned enterprise, they're not necessarily going to be deployed efficiently. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you've seen clearly a crackdown on large private enterprises, predominantly in the tech space. But at this, this is also, at least anecdotally from what you see in Shanghai, I mean, everybody is running a corner shop. Someone's selling shoes, someone's selling noodles. I mean, there's small private enterprises all over the place that are doing quite well. So I think China's in a transition right now where there is clearly a return to concentration of resources, which is not ideal. Far from it, in fact. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think this goes to the whole, Xi Jinping has a vision and he wants to be able to have all the resources he can with his team to be able to execute upon that. I think this just plays right into it. But there's no question in my mind, and I have a lot of debates, especially with Americans, that, I can't come to China right now. I'm not sure if you saw the headlines over the last couple of days, but Bain and Company, they had their offices raided, and if there's all of this negativity towards foreign companies. Not really. I think there have been isolated incidents, and trust me, they may have been targeted, but these companies are not victims. And it's just, it's frightening the foreign community. I think it doesn't need to be the case, but at the same time, it's not as easy to go out and build and do everything as a foreigner as it used to be. The term that I use with clients all the time is there are rules of engagement that exist now within China, and they're relatively clear. Now, most of the clients I work with, they don't like those rules of engagement because they're not the same rules they're used to in every other market they operate in. And my response to them is, okay, I understand that, but these are the rules. You can't come in and try to change the rules because you're some big Fortune 100 company. So I think, getting a bit, I think, off course to your question, but I think China's definitely moving back towards consolidation of resources. I have no idea how it plays out. It's unfortunate. But the US, relatively speaking, I think has moved even further away from essentially what made the country and the economy as dynamic as it was. And I hope that there's a return to saner, if you will, ideas over the course of the next couple of years.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, perhaps it's time for the disclaimer, because we're comparing these two places, because you also often hear, and I think Ray has received some of this, and it's like, well, how can you invest in China when you know, or when you suspect what's going on there for whatever egregious offense the Chinese government is making?
Right.
And my thinking on that, and I'm obviously, I'm a freedom maximalist. I believe in the absolute utmost individual sovereignty for everyone to determine their own fate. And then, so my first thing is, I don't really know the true extent of what's going on anywhere. Nobody really does. You can see drone footage, or you can hear reports, or you can have leaked files, but in this day and age, it's very difficult to discern truth, and perhaps it always was. And so there's got to be an element of at least hesitation or humility with that. But the other thing is where do you, like, I personally believe most governments around the world today are illegitimate insofar as they engage in unethical behavior. And so
Correct.
Where can you go where you're not stained with the illegitimate actions of the government under which you're living? Let's look at the United States. I mean, I've been a huge critic of, the geopolitical policies, let's say, of the United States for basically ever. I don't know if maybe we have to be in the 1800s to, look at a time where they didn't have that stain, but then you have, Indian wars and all that kind of stuff. So, the US escapades in the Middle East, millions of civilians, killed, millions of there's a lot to condemn there. The same is true for China. Now, their offenses, let's say, have been less outward. It hasn't been in the realm of geopolitical issues, let's say. They've been in the realm of domestic oppression, let's say. You could look at France. You could say, they still controlled, I think it's a CFA, The French franc in Africa, over 10 countries are still under that regime. They use that as a means of enslaving those nations, siphoning off the wealth and capital of those nations. That's obviously egregious and illegitimate. So we live in a world today where it's very difficult to put yourself under a governance regime that is untainted by, what we would deem to be unethical or immoral action. And so, I kind of allow those things to cancel each other out when we talk about these political and economic issues, because, how do you weight one versus the other? I think it's very difficult. So, that being said, and that disclaimer kind of being said, one of the things that I noticed about China, because, oftentimes when we have these conversations, as you said earlier, you can be kind of characterized as a China shill, whereas I'm just interested in assessing economic circumstances wherever they prevail to try to understand them better and then, determine your action accordingly. But as to your point about, and our point earlier about, the policy, seemingly the rules of engagement, as you just referred to, as being more pragmatic. I mean, look at what's happening in the States, where ideology is guiding so much of the policies around economic policies, energy policies, everything. And then you have, and it would probably take us several hours on a podcast to dig into what's causing this ideological and psychological fracturing that's clearly happening in the United States, where, you reference the pronoun stuff and all that kind of stuff. It's very destabilizing. It's very, there's not a lot of unity there. And my experience when I was in China was, especially when I'd meet the younger people that, didn't really grow up in the really bizarre, weird, impoverished era of China. Revolution. Right. They kind of take what can I can't do anything about the government anyway. As long as I have freedom to pursue my ends and my interests and to make money and to travel and all that kind of stuff, it's not that relevant to me. Now, again, you can criticize that kind of apathy towards your government, but that seems to be the mentality that prevailed when I was there. And there was just so much alignment, like, let's make our lives better. Let's be productive. Let's work hard. Let's educate ourselves. And that created, there was an alignment or unity in that. And so again, back to this discussion we're having about, how to properly assess these two things and not just, impose ideology on both and say, well, one's going to win because they're this ideology and one's going to win for that one. What are the actual specific constituent parts that make a market more competitive or not? And in China, you just see, you see everyone kind of ignoring or not engaging in the things that aren't productive to their own lives and pursuing things that are. And, the ideology component is not really all that present, whereas in most other places around the world, it's extremely present and it's extremely disruptive. So that, again, is another thing you have to consider if you're having that, historical debate or conversation about like which superpower will prevail in the end. That also has to be one, like, what cultural dynamic are people operating under, and how is that feeding into economic growth and market dynamics and that kind of stuff? And again, in China, it seems like there's way less noise in that particular input.
Yeah, first of all, and I say this half jokingly, but with regard to the United States right now, John, of course, it's all TikTok's fault, right? Got to get rid of TikTok and everything will get fixed. And my position on TikTok, and forget about things like the Restrict Act, but just TikTok in particular, I'm sorry, this is Facebook and Google and like all the behemoths that are getting leveled from their advertising revenue are saying it's owned by the CCP, get rid of it. Mm-hmm. Like, they've just made a better widget than you guys did, figure out a better widget and compete with them, and then that'll change. But no, I think, number one, and this gets a bit deeper, but I think it's important, is if you look at the Chinese and you look at sort of the country that is China, they're pretty much, yes, there are some minorities, but they're pretty much all Han Chinese.
Right. It's pretty
Have been forever.
homogenous. Yeah.
Correct. They're not separated by religion, not separated by race. And when you have that, you kind of, it makes life a lot easier about, like you had said, look, I just want to provide for my family and, you know, go to Thailand a couple times a year, have a good time.
Yeah.
And again, the needs and the desires, they're not, it's not to say there's no ambition, there is, but it's not this sort of grandiose, which ironically defined American, I think is one of the best parts, is having these real ambitions. I can run for president. Anybody can say that. But, you know, in China, it's a little bit more like, look, I just want to have a basic life. But one of the things that I think is super important that gets really overlooked when you look at it from the standpoint of Han Chinese, and there's that unifying element of it, is you probably heard this 1,000 times, right? Well, we understand that there's a cultural difference. Okay, I hear that constantly, but it's lip service. People talk about it, but they don't actually understand what it means. And I think that this is a critical element when you're talking about sort of competing platforms, if you will, between the US and China. Because if you think about it, Western, maybe not capitalism, but call it commercial interests. I mean, what, they go back, you know, and I think Dalio put this in his book, right? They go back to like the Dutch 500 years ago. But I think one of the most critical elements that has been missing from all of the analysis is everything in the Western commercial engagement, if you will, realm is driven by a Judeo-Christian ethos. You know, like thou shalt not steal or lie, or, you know, my word is my bond, and contracts.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that has pervaded for the last 6, 7, you know, however long to this very day. The Chinese don't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's one of the oldest cliches, right? You only start negotiating in China after you sign the contract. And again, people are like, I will tell people, look, when you're dealing with a Chinese counterparty, they're going to lie to you.
Yeah.
Oh, clutch pearls. I would never work with anybody who would lie to me. I'm like, all right, don't come to China. But they're not lying to you because they're malicious or they're bad. It's just culture. And, you know, they're going to do things that are so antithetical to how people operate globally. For me, it's now, oh, okay, I know you're playing this game. All right, no, we'll play that. And you get to know it. But what I have found fascinating is how righteous, predominantly the Americans, the Europeans are a little bit better, but the Americans get very righteous over this stuff. And I'll say to them, but it's a different culture. They've been around for a long time. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at that, you can see this playing out between what I would genuinely call the bellicosity coming out of the United States right now versus China. So you had said just before that, you know, you're trying to gauge what is going on sort of in the economic realms and gauge what the outcomes might be. And for me, I ignore hyperbole and I focus on action. Like, what is somebody doing? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how many headlines have we seen over the last 18 months that it is inevitable that China is going to invade Taiwan? Okay, I heard that all the way back in 2008. People were saying, oh, the Olympics are coming. This gives China the best opportunity to invade Taiwan. People have been making this claim over and over and over again. The difference now is that America has woken up to the recognition that China is now an adversary and a threat and a competitor. 10 years ago, or during the Olympics, nobody cared about China. China was just an afterthought. So when you're looking at this, like, there was some supposed leaked memo earlier this year by an Air Force general who said, my gut tells me we'll be fighting with China over Taiwan by 2025. My gut, like, how is that how you base your strategy as a military official? Mm-hmm. And everybody is coming up with all these cockamamie approaches, basically framing China as an aggressor and being more warmonger-like. And yet, what are the actions that we see? Iran and Saudi Arabia are now talking, right? You've got, the build out of the BRICS nations coming together because, again, I think one of the issues that you and all of your great guys talk about all the time is, what about the dollar? What's going on with the producing countries with regard to the commodity countries? You've got Xi Jinping going to Russia and calling Zelensky. And for me, and it's really unfortunate because it goes back all the way to 2001, in which you may remember, the towers fall, George Bush goes to downtown Manhattan and he gets on the bullhorn and he talks about people are going to hear from us. And then about a few weeks later, he goes in front of Congress and he says the following: you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And I think that ended up defining American foreign policy, not about the terrorist bit, but that the United States began to really look at the world as friends and enemies. There was no in between. Like, China was the only country that could get the Saudis and the Iranians to sit down. There was no way America was getting there. They couldn't get the Iranians to sit down at the table. And I think the whole concept of diplomacy, and don't get me wrong, I fully am aware that the Chinese are doing all of this for their own self-interest, as any major power would. I mean, America's been doing it for 50 years. But I think what's fascinating is if you look at the actions that China's been portraying versus the headlines and all of the commentary that's been coming out, my belief is China's never going to go at Taiwan. They don't need to. They just need to continue to grow to the point where Taiwan will get folded in as an economic, bulwark. They're going to have to deal with China because China, in my opinion, China will continue to evolve and grow just based upon what I see as the economic model that will, no matter what people think, that will become more consumer driven and less about exports and investment. So there's a lot for you to so-called unpack.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I noticed that, many years ago, and I agree that, the kind of American style of diplomacy was, to coerce, to bribe, to bring under the thumb of IMF, World Bank, what have you. And if not, kind of the economic hitman model, right? If none of that works, you go in with the troops. And so they govern, globally speaking, via threat of force. And I think, and China's been doing the opposite. And again, as you say, they're both doing it to serve their own interests. But China's going around the world saying, hey, you want some money? You want some money for that port, for those resources, for this or that? And at a certain point, and now perhaps being pronounced in terms of that point, a lot of countries are just going, I like that better. I would rather, if I'm going to be under the influence of a power, let's say, I'd prefer that power as one where, we can mutually benefit economically. And there doesn't have to be, the same aspect of the bully, holding the bombs over my head. Now, that's implicit in dealing with any superpower because they have that capacity. But It certainly seems like China's going around the world and trying to form economic and trade bonds rather than, bonds of subservience, or like, look, you have to do what we say because we sell you the weapons and therefore we can use them against you if you step out of line, use them against you if you step out of line. So I agree with that. And you're probably right about your assessment of Taiwan. Like, if you think about it rationally, why would, they go in with bombs when at a certain point, their economic might and capacity is just going to bring them into the fold anyway, more than likely.
Correct.
So I agree with that point as well. I wanted
let me just jump in for one quick second, because I think it's fascinating to look at history. When you were talking about sort of the differences between where the U.S. is today and China in terms of, presenting their outlook, saying, look, we'll give you money, or it's going to be, we're going to put you under the thumb, and more of a militaristic approach the U.S. has. America was not that way. I mean, the entire Dodge and Marshall Plan after World War II, I mean, it was marketed as reconstruction to make sure the world would be. but it was basically the Americans going in and giving money, to Asian nations, to Europe, the same, I would argue, as the whole Belt and Road Initiative that China's been promoting, where it's, look, yeah, we're gonna have, certain elements attached to this. It's not just free money, but that was how the United States, I think, as a more benevolent dictator, if you will, as a super cop, after World War II, they did it in a way that was, I think, a little bit more conducive. And China can take and look around at the playbook that the Americans used. And again, I personally, China does not want to be a superpower like the US. China does not want to be the world's cop. They're just looking for. I don't really believe it. I think they're looking to have a sphere of influence that is in their backyard. And maybe that goes a bit broader, but I don't know. I mean,
you may be right. You may be right currently, but so again, in this theme of stripping away names, titles, flags, and just looking at dynamics of action, power, markets, I think history would show that anytime a sufficient amount of power is achieved economically and then militarily, it's just used. That maybe that's the nature of power. Like once it's concentrated sufficiently, and once the imbalance is sufficient, it's used. And it ultimately abused, and then that's part of the reason why it's lost. But I just think if we strip it away everything, I think eventually, if China is to ascend as the dominant hegemonic superpower, it will flex its muscles in ways that perhaps currently seem unlikely. At least that's my opinion. Yeah. But
no, I would agree with that. I mean, that history has shown that to be the case.
One of the things, and final point on kind of China's approach to all this. If you go to any developing country, or not, I don't know about any, but a lot of the developing countries I travel to lately, because we could simply put it this way: America's foreign policy is about do what we say, or we'll execute destructive policies. And China is saying, if you do what we say, we'll execute constructive policies. And you see construction, like literally everywhere in the developing world, with the Chinese companies, Chinese building companies, real estate companies, all that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know if you've been to Phnom Penh lately, if you've been to Latin America, even El Salvador, like all these places, there's a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs. I'm sure that it's the case in Africa, and Chinese builders there, because they see opportunity, they're capitalized, they go there. As we said before, the work ethic, the hunger, all that kind of stuff, they're very kind of, the frontier Chinese entrepreneur is very much alive and well, and they're just spreading out all over the world to build effectively. And so again, I think that's an emblematic of what we've been discussing. But I wanted to go back to something you said, because you said that most of the Western world is kind of presumably predicated on this Judeo-Christian ethic or morality. And one of the things that I definitely found concerning in China when I was there was the lack of that. Now, you might say, like in a negotiation, fair play, everyone's going to be a little bit coy and, misrepresent and stuff. But at least at the time I was in China, I mean, it would often be the case that you could witness, like, egregiously, in my opinion, immoral behavior, whether that's like making false food products or making false goods and people getting injured as a result or sick or all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was obvious and prevalent in China. And, you say this is a cultural issue, which of course it is, but I do think, I don't know what the cultural ethical source in China was prior to the communist takeover. Presumably it was some mix of Confucianism and Buddhism and, the legacy of religious traditions that they had in the country up to that point. But I mean, it's really difficult to assess the impact of what happened in the 20th century, the most of the 20th century in China, because I think it was so destabilizing and so fragmenting in terms of the psychology of the people there, from, the deprivation, the propagandizing, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, all that kind of stuff. And that certainly was evident even when I was there. Like, again, that older than 40 population, you're like, wow, like these people are from a different planet. Like they are just,
Right.
you can go anywhere in the world and there's some degree of like coherence between your cultural perspective and the people that you're meeting. In China, you know, there was no place where that was less the case, in my opinion, than in China for that demographic. And so I suspect that fragmentation contributed to the lack of a moral compass in China. And what I've noticed, and this is you know, I'm hopeful about this, in that under 40 demographic, you know, my peers, let's say when I was there, and I think this is the case with many people, you may not know where your ethical grounding really comes from, because a lot of people today are not, you know, religious. And so it begs the question like, well, where does it come from? Is it just culturally inculcated and you're not really aware of it and it's subconscious, or is it due to your kind of assessment of different philosophies and Enlightenment era stuff or whatever? But the punchline being, they seem to have a far more ethical grounding, a far more appreciation of right and wrong and how to conduct yourselves accordingly in line with that. But it was very, you know, you'd see the videos all the time on WeChat or wherever of just like this, you know, insanely fraudulent behavior taking place in China. Yeah. And so I'm hopeful that is not too culturally ingrained, and that, you know, my experience or impression of the younger generation will continue to expand, and that will improve. Not to, you know, and again, this in this case, I'm not comparing it to the US, because, you know, we say there's this Judeo-Christian grounding, and that's supposed to, you know, convey some sort of ethical superiority perhaps. And, you know, there's an interesting discussion, like, why is it that the US can go all over the world, kill people, bomb people, coerce, all this kind of stuff, and still somehow maintain the moral high ground? You know, like, is it just because they're able to say, well, we're doing it in the name of freedom and justice? Like, how did that make sense? You just killed a family of 5 having dinner in you know, Yemen. Like, how do you justify that? But just my final point there is like, so we can definitely discuss the, you know, the lack of ethical grounding and immorality that takes place on an individual and a governance level in the US, you know. So I want to make sure this is all balanced, but just, you know, for posterity, it was something that was notable when I was in China, and I didn't like seeing it, but it seemed to be the case that it was phasing out with the generation, let's say.
I think it's just to put a final point. I'm sure you've got other questions, but we'll see. You know, we can circle back. I think there's been some movement, but again, I really believe that this is because the ethics themselves come from predominantly reputation and family circle. That's really what the driver is. Your family name, things like that. So depends on where you're at in those interrelationships and whatnot. Not really so much about the, you know, quality control, let's say, of milk or all of those big issues that popped up. You know, China, as I like to tell people, is, yes, the world's second largest economy. It's done a phenomenal job marketing itself as such, but it's also still a ridiculously risky emerging market. It's really an anomaly, I find, in the world, especially as investing, because you have kind of, is it Argentina or is it France? And it's kind of like, well, it's got a little bit of both. And I think that a lot of those issues with regard to quality control and everything else, they've been worked out by the market. And again, social media will do that to you when you get flamed on by a few million people on a Friday night.
Sure. And, you know, my observation was that the driving ethos or ethic was success. You know, I've been a part of so many conversations where someone might say, plain face, no qualification or disclaimer, like, yeah, you know, I lied and did this and that, but I got the deal, you know, like I won the thing. And, you know, parents and everyone around would be like, oh, good job. Like, great for you. Like, it was so much that was, and I could, at least at the time, I rationalized at least a part of it was like, when you're coming from a situation or a circumstance of such deprivation, you know, 50 million people starved or whatever the number is, I can see why the thing that would be most inculcated in you would be survive, get yours. Make sure you get that food, make sure you get that shelter, make sure you get that deal. Because if you don't, you're done for. You know, so you can easily see how that would be elevated. Hopefully, over the course of time, it will be reined in by some broader, you know, ethic or whatever. But we shall see. You know, one of the things that really struck me.
We shall see.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me when I first got there was, you know, there'd be a lineup of 10 people. Yeah, I'm sure you've had a million of these experiences, but someone would walk up, see everyone in the line, and just stand right in the front of the line and just go about their business. And what always shocked me was not just that there was no sense of fairness, you know, that they would just see everyone and go right to the front of the line. But if you said something to them like, hey, you know, there's a lineup here,
God, yeah.
they'd legitimately be surprised. Like a lot of the time. Well, perhaps surprised or angry. They'd be like, oh, well, like, I can't believe you're saying something to me for me doing this. Like, I'm shocked. And so it's like and it's like they didn't even see you. They didn't consider you at all, because their objective was you get to the front of the line for whatever the front of the line was happening, the ticket for the subway, the whatever. And no other considerations were sufficiently important to even notice. You know, it really tripped me out, you know, the first few times it happened.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what
let's get into some of the more macro level aspects of China's story. So
let's go.
You know, every country is dealing with this stuff right now, but what in your mind are the distinctions that are unique to China regarding debt, regarding money printing, regarding, you know, the issue of misallocation of capital? You always see the empty apartment blocks that have been overbuilt, you know, because of China's huge real estate boom, which incidentally, when I got there in 2009, they'd been talking about the real estate boom for a while. I was like, oh, it must be finished by now. You know, the boom must be over. You know, 15 years or almost 15 years later, it's still ongoing. So what's your assessment of the macro situation in China right now? And sorry, before I hand it over to you, one of the things I'd meant to say earlier was, as rosy as we're being about a number of the factors that contribute to China's economic success, obviously they're going to experience ups and downs and crises of various kinds throughout their history. You know, I'm certainly not suggesting that every move they've made, well, I'm highly critical of a lot of their moves, but I'm looking at the results of their moves, and especially looking at the results of their moves vis-a-vis or in relation to or in comparison to other markets around the world and approaches of other governments. And I'm just trying to assess it objectively. But, you know, the world will go through, you know, economic crises and currency crises and all this kind of stuff. And obviously China will experience that as well. My premise, or at least the contribution I like to make to the conversation when these America versus China conversations happen, is just that people are discounting the actual, you know, contributors to wealth creation and economic growth that are actually present in China. And I think they're focusing far too much on ideology. But in any case, hit me with your, you know, 2023, May 3rd, 2023, China macro analysis.
Look, I mean, there's no doubt, and I am complete in agreement with the whole concept of sort of over leverage, if you will. Most of the issue right now that people have been centering on, and I think accurately so, has been local governments. You know, China, interestingly enough, kind of has a similar system to the US, where you have kind of like states and a federal government. The only difference is the federal government is on top of all the states, whereas theoretically, at least in the US, you know, states' rights and the like. But there's been an enormous amount of pressure on local governments, be it at the provincial, or what we call the provincial, meaning the state, or the municipal, the city level, because there was this sort of approach where the finances of the local governments were heavily generated off of the land sales,
right,
that then went into properties. And when going back to an earlier comment, one of the things when Xi Jinping came into power, well, in his second term in 2017, is, okay, there was this recognition that the overburdened debt needs to become less so. Now, very open-ended in terms of how they were going to do it. The regulator at the time, the banking regulator, the CBIRC, was told to sort of look at where things were hiding, what have you, and try to address it. And essentially what you've had, I would say for 10 years, in fact, is a little bit of like driving a car with one foot on the gas pedal and one foot on the brake when it comes to dealing with not just over leverage at the provincial and municipal level, but how this ties into the property market. Because you probably saw all the, headline after headline, where it wasn't just that, the steps that were being taken by the regulator to try and make debt less, you just couldn't access it. That was then leading to these, essentially kind of what we're seeing in the States, I think, where these real estate loans were not being rolled over. And as they were not being rolled over, they weren't being able to get, the necessary capital to finish the apartments. Then you had a population that sort of had a big uproar because they were paying mortgages on apartments that hadn't been delivered yet, so on and so forth. It's definitely an issue. But much like I think everywhere else in the world, it's been an issue forever. You kind of were referencing, when you were here, you've had this boom going on. I mean, there's a guy, and I will do this to throw him under the bus, because this guy Gordon Chang wrote a book in 2000 called The Coming Collapse of China. That was 23 years ago. Kyle Bass comes out talking about this all the time. And the way that I phrase it is, look, the road to calling China's collapse is littered with more dead bodies than I can count now. That's not to say that there are issues. There are certainly issues. My focus, what I found interesting was during the pandemic, there was no helicopter money. Everybody was literally left to fend for themselves. The government did try to step in a little bit to try to help out with things like rent, where companies had offices that were under a state-owned enterprise landlord. But there really was not much. Like, I run a business. I didn't get any help. Everybody I knew didn't get any help. A lot of small businesses went under. But what was interesting is you saw a lot of new businesses, prop up after that. So in terms of where China's going, I'm not a macro guy in terms of looking at, the next year. I do think that over leverage is an issue. I always caution clients, though, to be very mindful that in situations such as this, China's got a lot of ability to sort of maybe not necessarily solve the problem, but they can address it. Let me put it that way. And I'll give you a classic example. Was this local government debt had been going on for a while, and in 2013, the central government just decided, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to convert that debt over to municipal bonds. They created a municipal bond market essentially overnight, and it became pretty big, and a lot of people found it to be a good opportunity to get more yield and credit and so on and so forth. Now, did it solve the problem? No, it addressed it at that time, but now we're kind of back in that situation. The banks, I think the banks are finding themselves up against the wall as well. So it's an issue like everywhere else in the world. Now, I don't think there's been as much money printing anywhere close that what you saw elsewhere in Europe and the States. It's been some liquidity pumped in, but China's very tactful where they try to put it in. Sometimes they take it out. They're struggling a little bit more this year. But overall, I think it's more about, for me at least, a multi-year process to see where things go. And the last 3 years have, with I think many places, have made it very difficult to try and ascertain the directionality at the macro level, especially in a place like China. I mean, 2022 was an absolute mess. And they're still trying to dig their way out of that at this point in time. It could all come off the rails in 6 months for all I know.
Yeah. I remember when I was there, the shadow banking industry was talked about a lot as like a big black box. Who knows if it's a massive threat, what's going on there. Is that still a thing? Imagine
No,
this.
that was one of the reasons why the property market got into trouble, because after 2017, essentially shadow banking, and what was really big was peer-to-peer lending, where you had middlemen that were matching borrowers and lenders together. And for the audience that may not know this, the Chinese investor is a very unique sort of investor when they look at how they allocate. Ignore property, because we all know the Chinese love property as sort of part of their net worth. But really, it's a 90-10 allocation. 90% of Chinese investable assets will go into short duration, highly liquid, low yielding but safe product. And then 10% is like swinging for the fences.
Right.
What can they get into? What's got high beta? What's the hottest ticket in town? They know they could lose it all. But what a lot of times will happen is that 90% of the allocation, unfortunately, people get greedy and they're looking for a little bit more basis points. It's like last year, when everybody was going after yield in Bitcoin, same thing. You can't just be happy with what you're getting. You're trying to be greedy. And that's where the P2P players came in, and that got shut down. But there were ramifications off of that. I think the PBOC had to come in, inject liquidity. They had to manage the process. But it's a lot more, I would say, for lack of a better word, functional. But a lot of the sideline lending businesses, yeah, they're all gone.
It's when I was there, another common sentiment or saying or opinion was that because there'd be political discussions all the time, at least amongst expats, and say because the critique that as we've been discussing, that I'm receptive to is that if a government that is increasingly controlling, it's absolutely possible that their intervention will be so felt as being so oppressive or hold back individuals or the economy so much that at a certain point the people may shrug off that government. We've seen examples of that throughout history, and that's part of the reasons why I'm hopeful about China, because as let's say good as the performance of this particular government, just specifically economically speaking, has been, I wouldn't be surprised if whatever the timeline is, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road, when the economic miracle is a little bit more subdued and people are more cognizant of, ideas around freedom and liberty and that kind of stuff, that they would, and they have a greater foundation of economic and financial security and stability to kind of weather any uncertainty that this would cause, perhaps they might say, we need a change and we want to change and we're not down with this anymore. And so, that's part of the reason why I'm kind of bullish on China long term, because the important constituents that allow for wealth creation are all there. And if any, the system of government, however critical you might be of it right now, well, that can change in the future. So you have people like, Peter Zion, who I've never been a huge fan of because he's just so arrogant. But he's, he basically, his line is China's going to go away, and I think in the next 5 years. Now, part of that is a demographic issue, which, interesting issue for a lot of countries out there in the world today, that, the replacement rate for the population is not keeping pace. So we're probably going to see population contraction in the next decade, let's say. But to say it's going to go away is just, completely asinine. And, it's obviously salacious, and he says it to get attention and that kind of stuff. But one of the things, let's talk Bitcoin related stuff now.
Sure.
So one, what's been your experience of Bitcoin in China? I remember when I was there, they banned it, every other year it seemed. And I was always, somewhat worried that they were doing so. But also, I'd love to get your take on the CBDC social credit thing in China right now, because it's something that you often hear mentioned in Western media, and, about the extent of China's social credit stuff in the CBDC. I'll stop. You say something so that the screen goes to you.
Okay, so here's my wallet that's got a whole 1.18 renminbi in it. Nobody uses it. Nobody. Now, I have discovered that there is a social credit score in my WeChat, and I think somewhere in my Alipay, but it's more of a credit score right now, but it's clear that it can be expanded into a very Black Mirror-esque
Right.
approach. But look, I mean, the CBDC was launched here. I think it was elevated in terms of the speed in which it was going to be introduced because of Libra, and when Zuckerberg was doing his whole, God knows what that was. But the Chinese pulled it off. But again, I think the issue is, like, more importantly, is every Chinese already kind of thinks that the government knows everything about them, because nobody uses cash. Everybody has been so, I mean, even me, like, you use your phone to pay for everything. Interesting anecdote is, in the last couple of months, I've started having clients clearly coming back. They haven't visited in 3 years. Every single one of them has said to me, Peter, I can't pay for anything when I'm here. And first time I was like, what do you mean? He's like, everything is QR based. You're either WeChat or Alipay.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that'd been going, like, no, before, like, you used to be able to get a taxi cab outside. You can't do that anymore unless you have Didi. Like, everything is off your phone. And most Chinese believe, and they're fine with it, that, yeah, okay, China's, the government follows what I do. Okay, fine. I'm not doing anything wrong. And, clearly a huge difference between, how we think and feel and whatnot in the United States versus here. So I don't necessarily think it's dead in the water, but I also believe that the level of people being ingrained in using WeChat and Alipay is just breaking that is going to be tough. So I don't know, maybe get helicopter money, maybe you find ways to be able to incentivize, possibly, but not really. I think what's more fascinating, and again, for me, when I look at sort of the strategic geopolitical moves that China makes, and again, I personally just think that they're wiping the floor with the US and Europe, and every time you turn around is, yeah, okay, they finally, for the 17th time banned Bitcoin, 2021. Personally, I loved it because I watched, we all watched the hash rate tank and then come roaring right back. So it was like, okay, so the system's operating as intended. And then everybody right now is like, wait, Hong Kong is going? I was like, yeah, because one of the most fascinating things that I talk to clients about is, is Hong Kong a foreign or a domestic business center in the eyes of the Chinese? And the answer is yes. It really depends. You remember when you used to fly into China, you would go into international, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan would be what it would be called on the international terminal, right?
Yeah.
So technically, Hong Kong is a foreign, city in sort of the geopolitical space. So China will do all sorts of things where they'll say, well, look, no, we've said X, but Hong Kong, it's one country, two systems when it suits their needs.
Right.
I think it's very clear, especially on the banking situation going on right now in the United States, that China knows that they've got a huge advantage right now in bringing the exchanges. I mean, especially Binance. I mean, Binance potentially can come in from the cold, whatever you think of them, or CZ. But ICBC, Bank of Communications, Construction Bank, I mean, there's money to be made there. Now, is this going to lead to another, boom? I have no idea. I do believe the confluence of events, however, between the halving, between what's going on with the bankings, regional banking in the U.S., now China's looking at it, it's looking pretty good. But it's
you mean for the Bitcoin opinion, price?
I think for the ecosystem being driven out of Asia, ideally the price, sure. But I think that, the United States has made it, again, that's why I had mentioned to you, look, I know everybody with their ad hominem attacks on Jason Lowery, he's a spook and all this kind of stuff. He's not wrong. I mean, his premise that you're going to see, I've said it for a while, the US is bankrupt. I mean, there's no denying it. Like something has to change. And if they were to go to not a complete Bitcoin standard, clearly, but they need to make something that is going to be able to address the issues that are there. Bitcoin is a strategic platform, makes considerable sense. They won't do it. I think we can all agree on that. Not with the people that are in power right now, clearly. But I'll make a prediction to you. By the 2028 presidential election, it's going to be a 2-issue election. It's going to be Bitcoin and China. That's it.
Interesting. So a couple things. When you're talking about Hong Kong, you mean that the policies regarding Bitcoin in Hong Kong have are emerging as being extremely open.
Yeah, correct.
And so you're saying that's kind of the Chinese government's way of having a little sandbox, as they've often done in the past, whether it's free trade zones or jurisdictions that they control. And part of the, as you said, whenever it suits their needs, it's either a domestic or an international thing. And part of the issue that the Hong Kong citizens have had has been the increasing influence of Beijing over Hong Kong, and the putting, people friendly to Beijing or controlled by Beijing in positions of power and things like that. But again, back to that point about pragmatism, it's likely that China sees an opportunity here to say, hey, let's try it out in one place and see how it works. Now, again, try it out through the lens of how can we control this, and how can we, make it suit our needs and objectives more. So I'm not suggesting that they're benevolent here, but just, your point is that they're using their kind of the different jurisdictions that they preside over, let's say, to experiment a bit more and see how things go. With regards to Lowry, I mean, I don't want to get into a big discussion about this particular issue, but what is it you see as the benefit to either Bitcoin, the governments that might adopt it in the manner that he's suggesting, or people broadly, individuals, users of Bitcoin? What is it you think you said is kind of inevitable? What's inevitable? That governments buy a bunch of Bitcoin, that governments, have a hash force, to be in the game? Like, what do you think is why do you think it's a good, thesis? Why do you think he's right in that?
Well, it starts with, breed love, what is money kind of conversation, which is, when you strip it all down and you look, and if you're being genuinely objective, the United States, the system that has been operated since Bretton Woods or even 71 or whatever your demarcation line you want to give, the can has been kicked pretty much as far down the road as it can be. Now, whether it's in another year, 2, 5 years, it's uncertain.
We shall see about that one. I mean, I agree, but I'm always amazed at how far it can be kicked.
I am in the same boat, but there needs to be, I believe there are going to be nation states that are going to see the advantage of having this asset that cannot be manipulated. And we know that, whether it's fractional reserve banking or whether it's the US dollar, again, I'm not sure if you follow him, but I'm a big fan of Luke Gromen. And, this whole debate over the US currency, it's like, look, the US dollar will be the currency for transacting. That doesn't mean the US dollar is going to be the reserve asset. Who would buy treasuries? I mean, this has been going on for a while. And when you start thinking about it and you start looking about, China's the global producer, the Russians are energy producers, all of these BRIC countries bring something to the equation. Europe and the United States do not. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to find something to hang your hat on. And I believe, as much as all of you guys do, that when you look at the Bitcoin standard, that it should be part of at least a discussion being had in the centers of power in DC and Brussels and elsewhere. But you simply can't, because it goes so counter to the powers that are in place right now. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah. It's something I'd like to discuss further and really dig into. I'm not so sure how much, a Bitcoin reserve or a hash force will benefit a government of a country and therefore its people. I rather see, I think, and this goes to kind of where you land ideologically, economically, and politically, I guess. But I think if a country is smart, that, and maybe it'll be both, but punchline being, I think and this is why, perhaps the lobbying in DC and stuff is useful. Eliminating as many regulations around the use of Bitcoin as an asset, as a money, as a currency as possible. I think that's what really unrestrains it and allows people to find the uses of it, the value of it, and to inject that wealth creation, that efficiency, that capital pricing, all the things that we know that it is, into an economy for the greater wealth creation and greater wealth generally for that market. That absolutely, so insofar as engaging government, by Bitcoiners, I think getting governments to realize the value of deregulating this and just kind of like setting it free, absolutely. Not that it won't do that on its own, given a sufficient course of time, but if we want to expedite any of this, but insofar as, well, one, I don't know how much I want to benefit governments in this day and age. I don't know how much I want things to go the way they want them to go. But even if that weren't the case, I don't know how much just holding a reserve and having a hash force will actually benefit government. So we shall see. El Salvador is kind of doing both right now. They've deregulated it, no capital gains. You use it as you see fit, use it as money. But they're obviously also stacking Bitcoin, and they're, presumably they're mining a little bit off volcanoes now and perhaps more in the future. So yeah, we'll see. And I wonder.
Let me just broaden out. Look,
yeah,
my perspective is not that only the state should be in with ownership of the asset and a hash. It should be. I mean, if it were me, it would be a amendment to the Constitution. Like, that's what I think is important, and that the state should be part of that. But it should be the right of the individual to be taking part as themselves, as a sovereign, to be able to get into whatever allocation or whatever they think is appropriate for Bitcoin. But I think that should not prohibit having the government. And again, I'm with you. Limited government's better, period. But I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how this does play out, because I think we can all agree that this is already going on. We just don't see it yet. Right, it's only going to come out in time.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. And there's no predictions to be made here, really. I mean, this is such a dramatic change and so disruptive that there's going to be surprises absolutely everywhere. And, one potential that comes to mind, just because it's what we've been talking about. But one of the things that I noticed, and surely you'll agree, in China, and you made the point that everything's QR code based for payments right now, is the speed with which, and largely owing to what you said earlier too, that there's such a homogenous population, but the speed with which they adopt new technologies. Like when WeChat and Alipay came out, my fruit guy had a QR code on his wall immediately. And so if I was paying 30 cents for a banana, it would be on a QR code. Same with the Didi stuff and the taxi stuff. Like, as soon as everyone used that, as soon as it was available. Remember the bike stuff? I don't know what that's like there now, but when the street bikes came out, first of all, you really got a sense for like how China and Chinese companies do things, because the scale was just like enormous immediately. So there was pink bikes, orange bikes, blue bikes, yellow bikes everywhere overnight, and everyone was using them. There was also gigantic like graveyards of spent bikes. If you're on the subway going somewhere out of town, that you would see them, literally mountains of just trash bikes. It's just stunning. People don't get the scale that's going on there. But point being that, and if you combine that sensibility to adopting superior solutions, let's say, which is that type of pragmatism that we discussed earlier, when the thesis of Bitcoin becomes more apparent, when the value of Bitcoin becomes more apparent, I wonder how that population will respond, because as you said, and I was having this discussion with guys in 2015 in China, because we were saying like it's too, WeChat and Alipay, China as a payment platform is not going to compete with them because it's just so easy, so seamless. You do everything on those apps. It's your entire life. But insofar as being a way to have outside money, outside the purview of government, non-manipulatable by government, even as a political gesture, and saying like the more money I have in outside money, the less I'm funding a government that perhaps I don't agree with on ideological or whatever grounds. To whatever extent the value that Bitcoin represents to those people becomes elevated over the course of time, how quickly, or will there be a tipping point where everyone just goes, oh, I get it, it's X for Y, and I didn't see it that way before. And by nature of how quickly they adopt solutions when they emerge, it just, happens overnight. And everyone, to your point earlier, everyone's like, I need at least 5% of this. Like 500 million people say, I need 5% in my, portfolio. And, that would be a very surprising, that would be a very substantial event in how things unfold.
Well, I can tell you that it's, there is at the moment a P2P market that isn't, it's there, but it's not as prevalent as it used to be. And people, again, it's one of the many things that I think is fascinating about sort of the Chinese is they get it. It's more of an issue. And I think this is why, the government continued to go with all of the sort of, year after year, ridiculous sort of, oh, we're banning it again, is this would be the ultimate capital flight. And capital flight is a serious concern for the Chinese government.
Right.
Especially after 2022. So it'll be really interesting because the border between the mainland and Hong Kong is super porous, meaning that a lot of people have money already down in Hong Kong. And, if you all of a sudden get a couple, which I think are going to happen in the next, month, get a couple of exchanges, you get some on and off rails through the Chinese banks. It'll be fascinating to see what that does in terms of directing. Because again, the Chinese, especially in the big cities, they already know both what is Bitcoin and the value proposition.
I totally agree. The capital flight is a huge thing, and the government obviously has an incentive to limit that. It makes me think of, I think the history of Arthur Hayes and BitMEX is actually, I think they started running cash across the border because they were just arbing they were just arbing the price of Bitcoin between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. And then in 2015, I think I was at a China Accelerator demo day. I don't know if you know China Accelerator. It's a local accelerator program. And BitMEX was one of the demos that were pitching. I wasn't in the position to invest at the time, but I certainly, and I think they ultimately screwed over most of their investors, so probably dodged a bullet there. But just fascinating that that I was there observing a team and a company that would, at least for a time, become very influential in the space. I know it's probably late for you, and we've took up 2 hours. What, just to start closing this down, is there something that we haven't discussed or a relevant issue that's happening right now that you think would be important to give some time to?
Look, there's probably 1,000. Again, John, I just want to say thanks. This first long form podcast I've ever done. And really just wanted to get it out there, have a conversation. People are going to agree, disagree, whatever it is, but just really appreciate the opportunity to be able to get some ideas out for people to start thinking about. The only thing I would say is, any of your other friends out there, I truly enjoy the conversations you guys have. More than happy to continue the conversation elsewhere on their podcast. So if there's an interest, let me know. But I just want to say thank you, and more than happy to do this again if you have any other questions.
Yeah, well, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I kind of forget how much I like reminiscing about the good aspects of my days in China, and you're certainly a great person to do that with, in addition to your other commentary. So I appreciate you giving me the time and staying up late for this. My last question for you is, you've been there for a long time. You've been in, these subjects and topics have been of interest to you for a long time. Why now to kind of put yourself out there for the long form stuff? I know you've done short hits on financial news programs and stuff like that. Is there a particular reason why now you kind of want to put yourself out there more?
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, which was, again, from like 2015 to 2018, like you had mentioned, I was, on the usual platform doing 5 to 8 minutes, and it's just like, it's just churning out content, and it's useless. Everybody forgets one day to the next. Nobody cares. And as we all know, you can't have a substantive discussion in 5 minutes or 6 minutes. So, I kind of was like, forget that. So I put that away, and then COVID hit. And I think 2022 for me was a real turning point because of a few things. One, all of a sudden, China became a headline, and not a good headline. Nancy Pelosi's flying in, China's going to invade Taiwan, protests, which, by the way, they weren't protests. Some very well-crafted pictures, literally around the corner. Okay, maybe my wife and I live on Wulamuchi-Lu near Anfulu. And that's exactly where, right, that's where everything went down. There were a couple hundred people, and they were, yeah, it's a great spot. I like right across from the consulate.
I lived on Wulamuchi and Yongja in that area.
Oh, right. Okay. Right around the
very
corner.
Close. Yeah.
But I think it was fascinating how the protests were sort of, it's all about Xi Jinping, because there were some people saying down with Xi Jinping. The reason the protests took place was because the central government came out with a 20 policy point plan. This was after the 20th Party Congress, to lift the restrictions on zero COVID. And the Shanghai, and not just Shanghai, but other regional governments, they didn't do it. Like, they didn't execute on it. And everybody who had been tired of a year came on the streets and were like, lift these regulations. And then, there was like a weekend where everybody was sort of screaming, a couple hundred people. And then Monday, they issued another 10-point policy, and the Shanghai government, like in a matter of hours, everything was done. It was kind of like a PTSD situation, because everybody was kind of like, is it really over? But no, I think there was a lot of, misrepresentation. I think people, and quite frankly, John, if I can not be too hyperbolic here, I just worry that where we're heading right now with what the United States is sort of, they're doing in terms of this, it just seems like they're pushing China towards war. It's like either it's war, or somehow the United States and China can reach an understanding of how do we live together for the next 20 or 30 years. And I don't see it. So if I can spend a couple hours talking over some ideas, someone on the ground, moving the ball forward a little bit, great. Giving some context, great. But it's got to be, again, like most things, it's got to be done through a discussion, and just you can't get it through a quote in the Wall Street Journal or a segment on CNBC. So
yeah, I totally agree, and I appreciate that approach. And I think one of the issues that I think we all had to be cognizant of is, so many of us, Bitcoiner people, are hypercritical of mainstream media and all sources of information, as you should be. You should be very skeptical of all that, because there's always an agenda or a psyop or ignorance or something that is tainting that information, possibly entirely. But I think the bigger, or many people are susceptible to when that information from those sources confirms one of your existing preconceived notions or biases, then you don't scrutinize it as much, which is a mistake. You still should, even if it confirms your bias, even if it is in line with the position you already hold, you should still scrutinize where it came from, what the agenda might be, all that kind of stuff, if you're really after truth, and hopefully that's what we're all after here.
And that's why the reason, and I said this to you over text, the reason why I reached out to you is I remember watching one of those quarterly sort of gab fests with you and the other guys, and the other three, I think it was Preston, I can't remember if it was
Boston,
Ross, Yeah, and they were going off on China, and you were the only one that was like, "Hey guys, hey, I've lived there for like 8, 9 years. You know, there's a lot more to it and everything." And it was the first time I'd seen anybody on a podcast basically not disagree, but just say, "Guys, let's pump the brakes and have a discussion about this."
Yeah. Yeah,
So
totally.
that was great to see.
Last question, I promise, because I forgot about this, and it
That's right.
won't take long. But we connected on Noster. Noster's been this sort of phenomenon since December of last year. I know it started earlier than that, but it really caught on after Jack made the donation. Everyone signed up for a client. What's the situation of Noster in China? Like, just give me your impressions or your experiences, and what's
there's certain ways. I mean, one of the interesting like misconceptions out there is, oh, if you have a VPN, you're going to get thrown in jail. VPNs are illegal. Technically, yes, but people that are in search of more, they use VPNs.
Yeah,
everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
You probably saw that when you were here. So there are ways, and it's interesting. There's a community of people out there. The harder part is getting the Lightning wallet up.
Really?
For me, it's been a little like I've got a bit of a cheat code because I use a Hong Kong phone that I have. So I'm able to access it through the Hong Kong network. But I've been working with a couple other groups, and I'm trying to get my wife to join as well. She's been a bit busy. But I find it absolutely fascinating because the interesting reach of people, same like mine. First time for me personally, 53-year-old old man using Lightning was like one of those light bulb, like, wow, this is amazing. And I'm just telling everybody, like, you got to get on, and onboarded a few people, but it's been fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Peter, this has been great. Really appreciate the time, and we'll definitely have to do it again sometime in the future. We'll give it some months and see what kind of issues pop up China related, and if sufficient, then we'll schedule another one.
All right. And as I tell everybody, John, I'm not going anywhere, so look forward to it.
All right, brother. Take care.
All right. Cheers, man. Bye.